Welcome back to The Middle Way. If you tuned in last week, you heard my conversation with Kwame Christian, CEO of the American Negotiation Institute, on how to have difficult conversations about race. There were a couple of key takeaways from that conversation for me. The first is that we have to build trust and show compassion to other people if we want to be persuasive, if we want to change their mind or their behavior, including on topics related to race and ideas. It's just simply not effective to try to persuade, shame, judge, ostracize, etc., if that relationship of trust and empathy is not there. So compassion is a matter of pragmatics just as much as it is a matter of virtue. The second takeaway is that it's crucial to validate people's experiences of race, including their perceptions of inequality, even if you don't necessarily see it that way or don't think that race had anything to do with a particular situation. This, again, is not just nice to do, but it's also a matter of pragmatism. And I think that both of these points have something important to teach us, both on the political or social left and the political and social right in our society. And after having that conversation, I thought a little bit more deeply about how salient and potentially healing these insights could be if put into practice. So I just want to elaborate on these points a little bit further. The way that I see it, the left could learn from the first point, just speaking generally here. There's a tendency on the left to use shame, blame, canceling, ostracizing, etc., as methods of persuasion when it comes to race-related topics and ideas. And I think all of this is very well intended, just simply might not be effective. Instead, what we tend to observe is people shutting down and becoming more defensive and hardened in their beliefs. We see more polarization, not less. I think this is a point or a fact that's hard to argue with. And then yet on the other side, and I hate to draw a simple line between this side and that side, but just for the sake of making this point, I think this is generally true. The right could learn from this second point that I mentioned. The reaction to race on the right is often, what do you mean race? Race has nothing to do with this situation. The tendency is to ignore race or deny that it has any implications in situations. And I think this is generally the goal for most on the so-called political right in the US, of course, excluding people who just come in with bad intentions altogether. But generally, I think this philosophy is about being colorblind, which in a sense, I think is also virtuous. But what this approach misses is, if not the outright role of racial bias in situations, it misses people's experience of bias or race playing a role in a situation. So, for example, in the last episode, Kwame gave the example of mediating a conflict between a family that thought a police officer was acting with racial bias. The officer in this mediation had an aha moment when he was asked to put himself in the shoes of the person or their family member and think about how he would have perceived a situation where an officer was acting like a quote unquote dick or asshole or something like that. So people's experience of race is important to acknowledge, even if maybe externally it may not have played a role. Sometimes we don't know. So that's something that I think that I tended to miss and overlook in my own observations and experience in these types of situations. We tend to focus solely on the facts. Was there actual racial bias or no? What are the facts of the situation? But even if, again, there's not an objective role here, we can't just neglect someone's experiences, their unique history, and what led them to feel that way. Now, I think some people might say in response to that, what good does this do? Why validate and reinforce someone's experience of something if it isn't objectively true? And here, again, I would give the same answer as, or the same reason that I gave for the other side of this conversation. And it's just that when we show empathy when we can validate people's experiences, it's pragmatic, it works, it gets us closer to a shared goal. To validate someone's experience allows them to potentially come to a new conclusion about a situation or to gain insights that they might not otherwise be open to. It creates a space for them to explore your point of view when they feel seen, heard, validated. Denying people's experiences forces them to shut down and to double down on the beliefs that they already hold. Creating a compassionate space allows different insights to unfold, or at the very least, allows people just to feel seen. So in both cases, this is healing. Validating experiences is healing and pragmatic and gets us closer to where we want to be in terms of finding more common ground and common sense. All right, with all of this in mind, I wanted to extend the topic of race in today's episode. Back in 2020-ish, I wrote a blog post about the middle way to race. So this was in the wake of the waves of protests that we were having and very heated debates about race in our society, which of course continue today, but seem to have cooled down a little bit. Nonetheless, these conversations are still salient and important and sources of pain for many people and disagreement, and likely to become front and center again in our collective consciousness and conversations at some point. And in going back and reading the post, I think the content is still relevant to the ongoing debate today. The ideas that I share here might conflict or challenge some of your own beliefs in one way or another. And I think this is good. I think that we should be able to disagree with one another or have debates that can lead us to the most effective solutions. This goes for this topic and every other topic that we have debates on in our society. So I think the problem is not so much the clash of ideas as it is the inability to skillfully and civilly test them out against one another, both in conversation and in practice, so that we can together find out what works best, what serves humans the best, what's pragmatic. This is going beyond ideology and identity. So our shared goal in these conversations and on these topics must be to find the best solutions, irrespective of ideology. And this is done through compassion, listening to one another, and staying flexible in our belief systems. Another friction point that might come up in listening to this episode is that, just to say it bluntly, here's a white guy talking about race. So if that's something that turns you off or something that makes you feel a little bit ambivalent, I understand where you're coming from. I think that I would feel the exact same way listening to this episode. Why should I be talking on this topic? What gives me the confidence, the credibility, or the right to talk on such a topic? All I want to say on this point is that in everything I do, I try to come from a place of wanting to see less suffering in the world for all human beings. Okay. And now, without any further delay, this is the middle way to racial equality, the psychology of polarization, and a more compassionate path forward. I'd welcome any thoughts, questions, feedback that you have. You can always reach out at hello@the-middle-way.com. America has made tremendous progress towards racial equality. This is especially true since the movements sparked by George Floyd's death in the spring of 2020. We've come a long way in shifting the hearts and minds of people across the globe, right? I'm actually not so convinced about this. Let me be clear. We've made unequivocal progress in shifting social norms, narratives, and laws. Racial and ethnic minorities continue to grow in representation across many sectors of society. Diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives have reshaped education and business culture. Justice, long overdue, is beginning to unfold for many individuals and groups. At first glance, we have and continue to make growing progress on racial issues. Yet the question that comes up for me is, how much have we actually changed people's minds? And more importantly, their hearts? If we look beneath the surface of structural change, the social and institutional edifices erected in the name of equality, have we really made progress in fundamentally changing how we perceive, treat, and feel about one another? Have the inner winds of change caught up to the outer? Alongside our gains, we have also simultaneously witnessed a rise in animosity and hate crimes towards racial and ethnic minorities. Despite an increase in social solidarity between many, we are also witnessing polarization across groups. Support for Black Lives Matter, for example, has unified many on the left and simultaneously alienated others in the middle or on the right. The chasm between Democrats and Republicans is expanding, teetering on implosion. People are regressing back towards their tribal identities, finding comfort and security in their own, quote, team, and othering the other side. It seems as though we're heading more towards war than peace. So despite the outer change that we justifiably hang our hope on, are we truly breaking down the inner walls that divide us? If indeed we're changing our minds about race, are we actually changing our hearts? Are we becoming more compassionate people? Are we creating lasting inner change, or simply installing new and ephemeral and potentially counterproductive cognitive programming around race? How do our current strategies influence polarization? And is there a better path forward? So to understand polarization in society, we must understand first polarization in the mind, in the psyche. The collective psyche mirrors the individual psyche. Duality underlies everything in the universe, including our minds. Our psyche is built on duality. It's built on opposites. Our brain is literally split into two halves. And our thoughts and our belief systems also reflect this duality. And then just to take it a step further, our unique capacity for language as human beings makes us especially prone to living in a world of psychological opposites. Let me try to explain this a little bit further. From the moment that we learn language, we learn to think in opposites. Just think about some of the most basic words that you learned as a child. The word big implies by definition that the concept of small must also exist. If something is near, then something else must technically be far. If something is short, then something else must be tall. In front means in back also exists. On top means underneath exists, and so on. You get it. There's a whole psychological science behind this called relational frame theory, which has been used to explain why and how human beings suffer. One of the founders of RFT, Steve Hayes, developed a behavioral treatment called acceptance and commitment therapy, or ACT, that's based on RFT and other Western and Eastern principles of human suffering. And this approach, ACT, I believe, is a really brilliant and effective, according to the research, and widely used approach to support human flourishing. So not only does duality underlie our most basic mental concepts, it also extends to more complex cognitive abilities such as decision-making and, of course, our beliefs, our belief systems. So just think about if you've ever struggled with making a difficult decision. As long as you could decide this, you could also decide that. As long as I can choose to quit my job, I can also decide to stay at my job. As long as I can decide to move houses, I can also decide not to move. The existence of one thing, by definition, because of our capacity for language, inherently creates the potential for its opposite. And here's where this really matters. Beliefs are the same way. Opposing beliefs are foundational to our psyche. They exist at a very fundamental level, often based on certain archetypes, and they extend all the way up to more complex social and political beliefs. Within any belief, an opposite will always exist. Let me just give some examples. As long as the belief in God exists, you must recognize that the possibility that God does not exist. As long as the belief in good exists, so does the possibility of evil. As long as the idea of free markets exists, then so will the idea or the possibility of something opposite to that, like a centralized government or centralized economy, also exist. As long as one could be pro-choice, one could also be pro-life. This reality of opposing and dualistic beliefs, belief systems in our individual and our collective psyche means that as long as we could possibly hold beliefs that are left-wing, we could also potentially hold beliefs that are right-wing. Both potentials always simultaneously exist. The psyche is always grappling with opposites back and forth. It's always trying to balance itself out. This is true individually and collectively. So the collective psyche, which is the vast container of mind that we are all part of, that we all share, also holds this potential for opposites. And I think that this is often under-recognized or underappreciated. So it too is always trying to balance itself out. That means that as long as certain ideas exist in the collective on the left, counter ideas will also exist or also have the potential to form on the right. The existence of one idea or the emergence of one new idea, almost by definition, again, means that the emergence of a counter idea will form. The potential is always there, and that potential continues to grow and actualize itself. And the more that one idea on one side grows, the more the opposite idea will actualize itself. We've all seen this play out. So we see this tug of war happening right before our eyes. As one belief becomes more extreme, there's an equal and opposite reaction on the other side. This is how polarization or extreme polarization develops in this tug of war system. When a new idea or belief system crops up, an opposing one will crop up as well. And the more that one side, this is key here, the more that one side tries to convince or persuade or judge or shame, embarrass, cancel, etc., the other side, the more we try to persuade the other side to believe in our belief system, in our side, in our belief, the more resistance we're going to encounter from the other side. So this is how polarization spirals, as both sides are using these ineffective strategies for behavior change. Okay, so what does this have to do with race and race-related issues? So let's just take a step back and observe what has been happening in America and across the globe. I think we continue to confront this question. We continue to ask ourselves, why are we so polarized? What's happening here? Why are we so polarized? And then we instinctively blame it on the other side. So in the heat of this tug of war, we tend to focus on our opponents, not the fact that we are equally pulling on the rope as well. Every movement in society sparks the potential for a counter movement. This is true, unfortunately, whether we like it or not, and is due broadly to the mind's inherent duality and specifically, again, to our unique capacity for language as human beings. Because of this, as soon as a new movement or motto enters our collective lexicon, unfortunately, its opposite will also likely sprout up. So just think about this example, the phrase Black Lives Matter. Unfortunately and unintentionally implies the possibility that they don't matter. It's opposite and ends up breeding the diabolical twins of Black Lives Matter, Blue Lives Matter, White Lives Matter, All Lives Matter. But it's not just these phrases that follow the law of opposites. It's also the amount of force placed behind them, too. The more momentum one side carries, the more resistance it meets. If we still need further examples of this, we can look at other movements and counter movements over the last several years. The Me Too movement, for example, in all its sincerity and inspiration and positive social change, doesn't necessarily seem to have fundamentally restructured the hearts and minds or behavior of men. If anything, I've heard more men be critical of this movement and its belief system. We also see the alienation and isolation of men and the birth of these other movements like incels, for example. So here's the takeaway. We can't change what's in people's minds by forcing another belief system upon them. Typically, this creates the opposite effect that one is trying to achieve. So we can't change people's minds necessarily through force. I think that we're better off appealing and trying to work with people's hearts. So let me explain that a little bit. I think that we have to help people see through their belief systems. This is working with the heart. This is working with a deeper consciousness. This is working with compassion, spaciousness, seeing beyond our individual identity and ideology and belief system. This is working on a deeper level with human beings where we can go beyond duality. And the way to do this, the way to help open up this space and this witnessing of our belief systems, this moving beyond, is by relating to other people compassionately. Again, coming back to this, the shaming, the blaming, the judging, criticizing, canceling, ostracizing, these things create more resistance. They force other people to close down, to double down on their belief systems, to move further away to the belief or ideology that you are, with good intentions, trying to convince the other person of. So instead, even though it seems counterintuitive, can we actually just meet people where they are at and all of the ugliness of their belief? This goes on both sides. Can we accept them exactly where they are and for who they are? Can we make space for them and their beliefs in this moment, just as they are, without that pull, that instinct to want to change someone immediately? Again, this is just a matter of pragmatism here. We can and should do this simply because it works. This is what the behavioral science tells us. And this doesn't mean that we have to agree with their beliefs, of course, but we can validate them. We can respect them. We can respect their value as a human being. We can try to find the good in them. And at the very least, we can try to avoid calling other people stupid or racist if they clearly are not intending this. This is a matter of pragmatics just as much as it's a matter of ethics. So the compassionate approach maintains that we have the best chance of changing someone's mind when we appeal to their heart. When someone feels accepted, validated, and heard, they might then actually change their belief systems. If you cross a bridge into someone else's world, they might be willing to also step into yours. So let me go a little bit deeper into belief systems here. Our mind is always battling with ideas. One of the principles and insights of relational frame theory and ACT is that suppressing our thoughts creates more suffering. Suppressed thoughts tend to return with increased frequency or duration or intensity. And there is really solid research behind this. This observation aligns with Buddhist thought. The Buddha taught us that craving and aversion lead to more suffering. Being attached to a thought, being attached to something, either through craving or through aversion, doesn't dissolve the thought. It actually just continues to make it persist. It continues to make it a thing. So trying to make something stay through craving or go away through aversion actually only increases our identification with it, increases our fusion with it, increases our attachment to it. And if we're thinking in Buddhist terms, this is actually just going to perpetuate and create more karma. This is going to reify our experience of the self, which of course leads to suffering. So in the same way, RFT and ACT teach us that experiential avoidance, or we might just say trying to wrestle with or change whatever is, just whatever our experience is, that this experiential avoidance lies at the heart of human suffering. And again, solid research to back this up. What you resist persists. That's the axiom. So engaging with something, whether we want more of it or less of it, is not the path to ending suffering from these perspectives, from a Buddhist perspective and also from a behavioral science perspective. Engaging with it, trying to change, trying to manipulate, trying to make something go away, or trying to have more identification, further identification, reification, more thought, more and more thought, more ideology. These are not the elements that lead to less suffering. Instead, witnessing our experience compassionately, without judgment. We know, again, from the science and from religion, leads to less suffering and ultimately leads to wise behavior. Wise behavior is, in my view, pragmatic behavior. It's what works. What works is what leads to less suffering at the end of the day. What works goes beyond our concepts, our ideas and beliefs and ideologies, which can keep us stuck in cycles of suffering. If we compassionately witness and observe our actions, and if we can be soft enough and flexible enough around our ideas and belief systems, then we can just observe what leads to the least amount of suffering. We can just observe what works for us as human beings. And I think that these actions, the pragmatic actions, or what we might just call wise action, ultimately benefits not only ourselves, but benefits the whole. We can keep coming back to that. So, in other words, it serves us to first view our experience non-judgmentally, with curiosity, with kindness, without trying to instantly make our thoughts or experiences change or go away. This is how human beings, I think, can create deeper, lasting change. In Zen, it's said that bearing witness, simply just bearing witness, leads to wise action. So just think about maybe something personally that you've struggled with recently or in the past. And think about how helpful has it been? How effective has it been to use shame and blame and self-criticism, or to try to quickly change ourselves into the person that we think that we should be? And these strategies tend to be effective at best in the short term, but not so effective in the long term. Carl Rogers, the humanistic psychologist, said that the curious paradox is that when I accept myself just as I am, then I change. Okay, so what does all of this mean and have to do with working through and overcoming racist beliefs and racism in society? We all have racist beliefs due to our conditioning. And we know here that the most productive way of dealing with a thought or a belief is to treat it with awareness, with mindfulness and compassion, to observe it non-judgmentally. And I think that it would be most effective and prudent to approach our own internal biases in this same way. If we try too quickly to eradicate our own beliefs because of shame, blame, guilt, we run the risk of simply just suppressing them. This means that they're still there, but we're just not paying attention to them. They've gone somewhere. So we instead might behave more and more in ways that can justify our conscious belief system, our conscience, and suppress our unconscious beliefs, suppress what is not within the ego structure or the superego, for taking Freud's perspective. So while this can go on pleasing and gratifying our superegos, our conscious selves, our idea of who we are, our identities, it's not necessarily a recipe for transforming us on a deeper level. Suppression is dangerous, as Freud taught us, because beliefs don't just disappear. They don't just evaporate and go away. They have to go somewhere. So where do these beliefs go? All of a sudden, we've eradicated our biases from our individual and our collective psyche almost overnight. Where do these beliefs go? They get embedded deep in the recesses of our mind, individually or collectively. Unfortunately, what I think happens then is that our beliefs get projected onto other people. Other people are the racists, not me. It's those other people. They deserve all of the blame. It's also known as scapegoating. Has something like this happened with movements in our society in recent years, like with Black Lives Matter, particularly as us white folks are attached, right, or affiliated with it? Where did all those beliefs go in the amalgamation of that group of people and the diversity of people within that movement? Did they just go away, or are we still fighting those belief systems? Are we still encountering those belief systems just through other people now? Now, doing so, displacing these beliefs onto other people, onto the other side, and having them take on the burden of being the racists, this is very pleasing to the ego. As long as I can be on the good team, I will gladly fight against the other team. They're the bad people. So as long as ego can be good, as long as ego has something to fight against, it can continue to justify itself. But when ego wins, compassion loses. And when ego wins, the whole loses. When one side wins, the collective loses. So we claim to be fighting, to be defeating hate, to be defeating racism, to be bringing more empathy and love. But as we know, we can't defeat hate with hate. Defeating hate is really an oxymoron. We can only do that through love. You can only dissolve hate by being the thing that you're asking other people to be, and that is love and compassion. So in the name of unity, in the name of bringing people together, we actually, the function of that actually ends up missing opportunities for deeper unity and connection on the level of the whole, on the level of the collective. I read something recently in regards to the behavior of systems. I'm reading a book now by Donella Meadows called Thinking in Systems. And we can think about systems as really anything from the micro to macro level. Systems, complex systems exist in our cells. They exist. Our body itself is a complex system. The communities we live in, cities, countries, the world itself, ecosystems, these are all systems. And when thinking about a system's purpose, what was so beautiful, this insight, is that it doesn't really matter what a system says that it's aiming to do. If you want to understand the purpose of a system, look at its function. What is the outcome of it? That's the purpose of a system. It's not. So again, here, this is seeing beyond, seeing through, seeing past the ideology of something and looking pragmatically at what's the actual function of it. And we can look at and ask this question about our approach to defeating racism in our society today, I believe. What's the actual outcome of it? Is it actually bringing people together? Leave that for you to decide. So we're talking about suppression here. As I mentioned earlier, suppressed beliefs will end up coming back stronger if we suppress them in frequency and duration and intensity. And usually they come back uglier as well than their original form. This might happen individually. We might find ourselves accidentally behaving in ways that offend our conscious beliefs, or suppressed beliefs offend our psyches through the collective. They come through the other side. They come through the other political party, luring us into a battle, into an ugly battle with the disowned parts of our psyche. If one side decides to disown its racism without truly transforming it, that's a hell of a lot to be encountered and to be met through the other side. We see its form displaced and manifested in uglier form because that's what the unconscious does. It comes back, it presents itself in its ugliest form through the other side, through opposing belief systems, through opposing behaviors. And so we're forced still to reckon with the things that we're displacing or suppressing, just in a way that is less effective than if we truly transformed these things within ourselves through compassion and love and non-judgment and understanding and patience. So the current approach to eradicating racism, I think, to the approach of mentally defeating it, the approach of forcing people to correct their speech, the approach of shaming, blaming, and othering the other team, the approach of canceling. These approaches risk reifying racial differences in the individual and collective psyche. I think, personally, that these approaches teach us to see more of race, not less of it. Now, I have to say here, it's important to point out that these approaches, I believe, are completely well-intended. The motivation behind them, I believe, is pure. I don't think that there is bad motivation behind them. I think we all want the same thing. We all want to live in a world, be in a world where there's more compassion, more connection, and we don't have racism. So I'm not questioning the motivations of these approaches or suggesting that there is some malicious intent or conspiracy or something to create more racism. What I question is the function of behaviors and the importance of looking at the function of behaviors. This is why I feel so strongly about the pragmatic approach and looking beyond identity and ideology, which keeps us stuck in just that. It keeps us stuck in ideology and not looking at the actual effects of our behaviors. So just on this point of these approaches making us think more and see more of race, making it more of a thing. So again, coming back again to Buddhist thought here, if we're trying to push or pull, craving or aversion against something, it actually increases our attachment to it. So I think this is, in my perspective, something that's happening in our collective psyche around race, is that we're actually grappling with it again with the intention, the good intention of trying to fix it in a way, but it's actually teaching us to identify more with it. So there was a Substack article, this is a while back, and as I mentioned this, I wrote this blog post a couple of years ago. But at the time, there was a Substack article from Barry Weiss called The Miseducation of American Elites. And in it, she quoted a high school student who's said that the school curriculum that he was receiving, it was an anti-racist school curriculum, has, quote, made me think about race more. She describes talking with students and parents who also feel that these pedagogies conflict with their core values. They worry that these programs are backfiring. They worry that what these programs are teaching children, and adults for that matter, is to see more of race. And they worry that it's teaching them, yes, as I said, to see more of race. So we have to wonder, are we, through these pedagogies, are we really changing minds, or are we just tingling up our thoughts? Are we just adding more layers of complexity to thought? Are we tangling up our language more, creating these very complicated, complex webs of thought, almost like building a snowball or a ball of yarn, continuing to wind more and more around it? Are we just making it more complex and making it feel as though on some level we have the right belief system, but really on a deeper level are more identified and attached to this concept of race, and therefore are seeing it in more places? And as we can imagine, that could potentially have a counterproductive effect. So as I write here in the blog post, are we simply teaching ourselves to be good boys and girls so as not to be called a racist. This all makes me wonder if there is a better way. So you might be having the thought come up, might be wondering, well, if I don't adopt an anti-racist approach, then how can I contribute to the cause? If I take a neutral approach, as I seem to be suggesting here, and not, quote, make race a thing, wouldn't this be the equivalent to just being a passive bystander and therefore allowing racism to persist? Let me try to clarify that. I'm not necessarily advocating here, or not at all advocating for a passive approach. What I'm arguing for here is a middle path. And this path, I believe, can be just as engaged, but ultimately more productive in creating the equality and equanimity that we strive for. It can be just as engaged, can be just as active, but a different approach. The middle path, as we have come to see, is rooted in compassion. Deep compassion. Compassion for everyone and everything. This place of deep compassion, the middle path, the middle way, means that we start from a place of remembering our interconnectedness and our common humanity. We remember and celebrate our differences, both on a superficial level and a deep level. Yet we can still have the vision of heart to see beyond superficial differences. We can see ourselves and the other person, which is what it means, which is what common humanity means. Knowing that on some level, we're one and the same. Knowing that on some level, we are both humans with a shared wish to be happy and to be free of suffering. So I think this should be the starting place. So in other words, this is a human first approach as compared to a race first approach. The latter approach, the race first approach, as I've outlined above, runs the risk of generating greater tension and backlash in the individual and collective psyche, keeps the mind locked into a tug of war process of race related beliefs, which can either maintain the status quo or worse. The human first approach is more consistent with the psychological principles of reducing suffering and creating deep, lasting change. It's fighting fire with water rather than more fire. It's fighting hate with peace rather than more hate. It's dealing with disconnection with more connection rather than more disconnection. The middle way of compassion disarms the other side. It disarms the war because there's nothing to fight against. If we're not pulling on our side of the rope, there's no need for the other side to pull on their side of the rope. When we bring compassionate awareness to our experience, our wisest, most compassionate selves naturally emerge. Our behavior then falls in line with the highest good. The middle way implores us to show up compassionately as a collective to our current experience as things stand right now. Doing this allows us to be naturally, spontaneously guided towards the next best step. When we step out of the ego's dance, then we can step in line with our deeper, more compassionate nature, which then leads to pragmatic action that serves the highest good. I don't think that we need to convince or shame or blame or re-educate ourselves on being kind, because I believe that we already are. I don't think that we need to use these strategies with other either, because I believe that they too are already kind. We just need to help people get there by breaking down instead of building up the ego/language-based structures of the mind. We do this by showing up to other people compassionately, regardless of who they are, where they are, and what they say. The greatest leaders don't tell people the way, they show people the way. They embody the qualities that they wish to inspire in other people. So this is active. This is the type of activism that I believe will produce more lasting change. Rather than trying to change people's minds, we need to try to change their hearts. If the investment and resources that we spend on anti-racist curriculums went into training compassion, especially in kids, I think that we don't need to teach them what to think. We need to teach them how to relate to other people and themselves. But if the resources that we spend on these pedagogies went into training compassion, we wouldn't need to try so hard to change people's minds. Again, I believe we already are kind. We need to help people drop into that space, not create more walls and defensiveness and armor around themselves. The only way that we can do that is through showing up to people compassionately. So of course here, training people to be more compassionate, that sounds pretty Pollyannish. It does. But I think that it would have a greater return on investment than the strategies that we're currently using now. So the middle way approach is neither a colorblind approach nor an anti-racist approach. Of course, we can't be completely colorblind. We're going to see race. As long as we can see color, then we will see color. We will see race. As long as we can distinguish the color of someone's hair and eyes and so on, we will also inevitably see the color of someone's skin. And of course, we should acknowledge and respect and honor and celebrate the realities associated with one's race and culture. We shouldn't pretend that one's history and current circumstances, especially for those oppressed or disadvantaged, do not exist or do not influence that person today. We can acknowledge all of those things. We can see all of those things. Our most compassionate selves, the most compassionate parts of us actually must fully bear witness to these realities. We must see all of it. We must feel all of it. We must be there with all of it and see and understand and validate other people's experiences. With that, then, we still have to ask ourselves the question if race and the intricate and complex and deep stories surrounding it should be the primary feature that we care about in human beings. Where should that stand on the hierarchy of qualities, both visible and invisible, that we value in other people? How should we train our minds to unconsciously and consciously attend to these qualities? So maybe perhaps the primary thing about a human being should be just that they are a human being. What if we help people to prize this, our shared humanity, first, over other prejudicial qualities? So it could be wrong, but isn't this the outcome that we really wish to see here? To really see our interconnectedness? Isn't that the outcome that no matter where you stand on this spectrum or complex web of belief systems and ideologies and approaches and thoughts about race, I wonder if we don't all have that in common? To simultaneously acknowledge the intricacies and the individuality of people and their cultures and the stories behind them and the unique ways that we live in this world, and to simultaneously see our shared humanity and to really, really value that and prize that. I think that seeing through to this common humanity is a fast track to compassion, not the cognitive maneuvers associated with re-educating, quote, re-educating ourselves. This approach, the cognitive maneuvers, the creating more complex webs of thoughts and education, keeps us stuck in the mind, keeps us stuck in ego, keeps us stuck in duality, reinforces sense of identification, reifies race, keeps us stuck in the status quo of our own beliefs, fighting with them, pushing against them, trying to get them to change, go away, suppress them somehow, project them onto other people. This approach maintains the status quo of race in our current culture, or potentially worse, I believe, in the long run. So if we train our minds in this way, we might actually miss out on a much simpler, more beautiful opportunity to see each other on a deeper level. If we focus exclusively on training ourselves to see race everywhere, we might find it hard to undo this conditioning of the mind. The collective psyche will continue to be searching and grappling back and forth with this duality. The more that we're stuck in duality, the more that we're identified with duality, the more that we're grappling with it, the harder it is to disidentify from it. We don't want to reinforce separation, sense of separation, sense of duality, sense of identification to a point that's unhelpful, to a point that's more polarizing. This feeds the ego. And this, I believe, is why we have only appeared to make progress. We have rightly focused on outer change, hoping that it would create inner change. Yet we're still haunted by the same demons from our past. I think that instead we must reach not for people's minds, but for people's hearts. We must cultivate compassion in ourselves and show up to others in this same way. The middle way is not neutral. It is a path of radical compassion and just may produce radically different results.